I actually moved back from Hong Kong as of the beginning of September. I had just enough of Asia after a decade away from the US and from my kids. So I'm back and adjusting to different scale of projects, different kinds of clients, and so on. But I'm near my kids, all three of which went here to Illinois, two of whom went to the School of Architecture. So I'm very, very proud of them. Most of my life I've been interested in mobility. Well, a long time ago we called it accessibility. And that was my way of being involved with people-centric design. I had the chance to do a master's thesis on accessibility, working with Michael Graves. That was a really long time ago. And then co-authored the very first accessibility standards for the General Services Administration of the United States. And I've stayed interested in mobility, but now broader, all modes of transportation. But at the same time, I'm quite interested in sustainability and now resiliency. And I think there's a little difference between the two. And I hope I can make some comments about that today to give you an idea of what's going on in the profession right now. Mobility is the cornerstone of environmental sustainability, I think, the backbone of world economies, and access to prosperity for our societies. So I've always thought mobility was really, really important, and I've made every project I work on a bit about mobility. Resiliency, similarly, is social and economic, not just an environmental. We tend to think about resiliency as disasters, floods, earthquakes, the wildfires in Australia, but it actually is the resiliency of our economies to bounce back after, say, a disaster, or our society to deal with geopolitical issues. I believe we have the responsibility to anticipate this disruption because of a variety of factors, and we're likely to become liable if we do not. So we can't wait for a disaster to happen. To act, we need to invest in resiliency. And so as architects, landscape architects, city planners, and urban designers, we must embed resiliency just as we've integrated sustainability in everything we do from here on out. So mobility is, for me, really mobility-oriented development as we think of cities and communities. This is a kind of evolution from TOD, transit-oriented development, which was kind of coined here in the US years ago to induce ridership. Everywhere else in the world, people are transit users. And certainly in Chicago we are, in New York, in Hong Kong. And so I think of it more as mobility-oriented development that sustains ridership. It discourages driving, although allows it, anticipates new forms of mobility, makes walking and biking safe, adds a mix of uses to our communities and our districts and urban environments, and offers diverse placemaking. So it supports transit uses across the board and thus promotes urban equity to access to ideas, prosperity, et cetera. So it's something that I've been honing over a number of years of working on this. And again, really focused on the multiple modes of transportation: air, water, surface transportation, even below water levels in terms of transportation from place to place. I believe that we improve the quality of life by giving modal choices to people. And this delivers a value to our city, a competitive value that improves the prosperity for everyone who lives in those cities. We create this value by investing in transit hubs. There's a photograph up there on the top of one of many stations I worked on. This is in Spain. It got skewed, the photograph, but whether it's a train station or an airport or a seaport, you see much more mix of uses. That's not a utilitarian service anymore. It's a way of life, a destination in many cases, around and at stations. So it's not just inside the station, but on the sites and the sites surrounding the stations, and then beyond those stations and hubs. This project in Sanya on Hainan Island, the kind of Miami of China, has an old train station here. And high-speed rail and intercity rail is being added to that. Next to the station is an old campus that had fallen into disrepair. And we had a chance in a competition to kind of rethink this whole thing. Add high-speed rail to the station, rejuvenate this campus now as a wellness campus. So the retirees and other people that are coming to Miami, to Sanya in the winter months, can get a knee replacement or go through rehabilitation. So combining wellness with transportation. And then north of the station, the government had planned a huge campus somewhere else, very, very far away. And we suggested bringing those civic functions close in so that the mobility hub was more than just train service, bus service. There were 500 buses that go in here and 10,000 bicycles. It's a very different world in China and Southeast Asia. So resiliency, I did pick up this typo, but didn't make it into this particular version of the slideshow, is about protecting that investment in mobility. And I think we have a responsibility to predict, to anticipate what those risks and hazards might be, to prepare and design to those, giving the ability of the places we design to respond and recover, and in some cases with a certain amount of flexibility to adapt to further changes that might be needed. Again, we certainly think about resiliency in terms of environmental issues, extreme weather events, sea level rise, lake level rise. I'm from Lake Ontario. Water levels were 5 feet higher than normal this year. Flooding, of course, drought, and wildfires on the other end, hot temperatures, and natural disasters. I think this is where resiliency has been residing for a while. But I think we see now that there is an economic concern of financial systems, trade disagreements, the ability or interest in reinvesting or even investing in mobility, taking care of the systems we've got in terms of operations and maintenance. Trends, people are shopping online, maybe not using transportation quite so much or differently now. And social issues, geopolitical, safety and security. Having come from Hong Kong and kind of dodged a few of the protests, it was very interesting being there earlier this year. Population changes, both increases and decreases. Immigration and migration of forced migration of people is really changing the way we think about the places that we design. Education and awareness of some of these issues, of course, is important. Jobs and labor. Health, think of the coronavirus right now. Our offices are shut down in China. All of my colleagues in Hong Kong are wearing masks. They've shut the borders in Hong Kong. My best friend's son is being sent back from China from the Peace Corps this weekend because they're saying it's over. You know, your program's over. You're coming back. So all kinds of things like this. Yes, you might be able to anticipate. Some kinds of events like this you can't anticipate. But I think as designers, we have to think differently now than we used to and design to protect the investments we make in mobility and in our communities. So the process, you know, when I start thinking, oh my gosh, there's just so many different things that could happen, and how do you respond to that? It's a little bit like sustainability was 10 or 15 years ago. We make long lists of all the things that we could do, and LEED made it easy for us with the checklists. Now it's smart cities. If you work on a smart city, all the things that you could possibly do. How do you decide? Because you can't do everything. You can't afford to do everything. So I think we recognize that scoping, identifying the areas of vulnerability of a particular place is an important first step. Then optioneering, thinking about ways that you might respond, but then prioritizing these, because again, you cannot afford, no client, no city, no transit agency can afford to do everything. So you have to make some decisions and priorities and move forward with those. And then develop strategies to get the projects off the ground in bite sizes. So it's not so huge that no one knows what to do, but bite-sized pieces of projects, and then focus on implementation. I think as an architect, I tend to want to build things. And until 15 years ago, when I stopped working on buildings and now work on hundreds of buildings at a time, I've always been focused on get it built. And so now as a planner, I'm always thinking, get it implemented. It isn't just the process that counts and just the stakeholder engagement, but actually figuring out how to get a project constructed. But like all planning efforts, the work is never done. Just when you think you've got it all figured out, something will happen and you're back to planning again. Now, resilience, I think, again, we think of it in terms of disasters. And so places like New York after Superstorm Sandy, had to figure out, well, the MTR was flooded. They projected, this is Arcadis working on this project with Big, where the water would go in another case of superstorm or sea level rise. Emergency measures to keep water out, et cetera. So we want to get away from recovery as the answer to resiliency, and more to think about how to understand what the risks might be and then manage and design to those things. So it's beyond just a discussion of what might happen. It's an opportunity to add value to a city. So in the case of the Big U, the ultimate solution was a floodable park system that protected the highways around Manhattan, that protected the subway system, that moved critical infrastructure out of harm's way to upper levels of buildings, recapturing that space for other uses. So it's not only about risk, it's about opportunity. And I think as designers, we need to think about it that way. Of course, the problem with resiliency, recovering, for example, is that it requires additional resources. And remember, in the olden days, when we talked about sustainability, everyone said, oh, it's too expensive to do it. I don't want to. The developers didn't want to take that on. But once they realized that by investing in sustainability, they were actually saving money over the life of a project, it changed their thinking. And I think that's the same way with resiliency, that if we think of it in terms of investing for the long haul and the solutions that we come up with as both long-term as well as short-term solutions, then it will naturally make it easier for us to convince our clients, whether they're cities or transit agencies or developers, to make the investment. In New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the US Army Corps of Engineers constructed a $14.5 billion hurricane storm damage risk reduction system that Arcadis worked on that demonstrated its efficacy in 2012 when Hurricane Isaiah struck. New Orleans remained safe, and so it was 100% return on investment in 1 year. So what we're finding is that we've got to help change the mindset, change our own mindsets first as designers and planners, but change the mindset that it's not just a short or a medium-term solution, but something that must take place over a longer period of time. When there's apathy or disinterest, there's a big change of mind when there's a disaster. But why wait? Why wait for a disaster to happen? Be thinking about these things now. So even if the chance of a flood, let's say, was very low, questions from concerned citizens and stakeholders move from the debate about recovery to why were we not better prepared? And why wasn't this foreseen? So go back to the first slide I put up. I have this sense that we might become liable if we don't think about this. And so as we work on an individual building or groups of buildings or a transportation system, we need to be thinking about this. Think of actually San Francisco. I went to school at Stanford and experienced a number of minor quakes. Obviously, the seismic code was put into place a very long time ago as a reaction to earthquakes that frequently happen in California. Think of these other things: wildfires, flooding. These sorts of things can happen again in places. And should we be required to do fireproof buildings in Southern California? I don't know. It's a question, but we ought to be thinking about it. And so, to me, thinking about resilience is reframing the conversation, again, around the value of investing in it so that you do not lose lives, that you do not damage property, that you're not forever just recovering from a disaster, but you've anticipated it and have planned for it. So if you put these two things together, resilient mobility, this is about thinking about the systems that we use to get around and how to make sure that they're as robust and resilient as possible. There are some case studies already. Again, Arcadis, our mother company, worked on London Bridge Station and did resiliency work there to protect it against terrorism, attacks, and blasts. And when you think about it, okay, 9/11, the response to that has been a resilient response. We just need to do more, in my opinion. Even transit-oriented development here in the United States is a combination of coastal, in the case of Honolulu, coastal industrial development combined with mobility that can withstand sea level rise and potentially other threats. So managing the resilience, when you think about transportation, we're looking at both existing mobility systems, the opportunity to maintain, rehabilitate so that it can recover from an incident, but looking harder at mobility assets that are susceptible to past and future events, whether that's flooding or wildfires or drought, if that has an effect, and it might in some cases. We assess and prioritize those risks and then build in solutions, preventative solutions, into the rehabilitation of those existing systems. And as mobility assets like systems approach the end of their design life, it's a really great opportunity for us to totally rethink this. I worked on the red purple line in Chicago, which is 120 years old. And the punchline and the good news is it's being rebuilt, but it took us 10 years of figuring out what to do, what were the alternatives, and then getting the funding, et cetera. So these things are not instant, and they take a kind of perseverance and dedication and commitment on our part to push these projects along. And obviously, when we have the chance to build a new system, it should be all stops out. And I'm going to show you one in just a moment. So planning for resilient mobility, I showed you Sanya up there. I've worked on the Longyang station in Shanghai, and there the driver is a rapid increase in the number of people and the number of people using the station, and so it has to be expanded and connected to all the other networks. This is where the maglev is that runs from the airport into Shanghai. In Boston, we've done some mapping of what would happen to Boston proper. Here's where it is now if sea level rises as bad as we think it might be. So there is definitely work to be done. I had the chance to work in Hanoi on the Red River, which starts in China. It's presently controlled by dams in China. And so the geopolitics of letting water out and down into this river is one of the hazards and the risks that we had to tackle. At the same time, we were concerned about natural assets, wildlife. This is a shipping river, so continuing water transport there, allowing for some of the 9D cultural temples and landmarks to be able to be safe in the event of extreme flooding. And as we looked at this, we realized that this was not only just kind of reacting to the risks of flood, but an opportunity to redevelop and redevelop resiliently along the edges of the river, to keep people that have squatted there for many, many years, their homes, instead of relocating them, allow them to stay in place, improve their environment, and protect them from the risk of flooding. I've worked on the all of West Jakarta. It's huge. It's five phases of work. Jakarta, as you know, will be underwater by 2030, at least the northern part of it. And it's a combination of water problems inland and sea level rise. And so when working on a brand new city in there, we were really concerned about how do you protect? Should we be building along the coast? And if we do, what do we need to do to protect against sea level rise and then find a way to deal with the water that was coming from inland? Really fascinating project, and a client, a developer that was willing to tackle these issues. And most recently, I worked on the Van Dun Special Economic Zone. It's 2,200 square kilometers. I think that's about 1,000 square miles. 600 islands north of Halong Bay, 30 of which we realized we analyzed and realized we could develop on those, but carefully, because sea level rise, even in northeastern Vietnam, is an issue. We have problems with very unstable terrain. We have mudslides and landslides, so if you develop near it, you've got to be paying attention to that and putting in resilient measures to deal with landslides if they happen. And then in this case, we were dealing with a new airport, seaport, cargo ports, so maintaining open waterways while respecting the ecological environment. Really interesting project. So I mentioned earlier, I'm adjusting to projects here in the United States. They tend not to be this kind of scale or this comprehensive, but I feel very, very privileged to have had the chance to work on projects like this. I'm going to show you one last project in a slightly more detail. It's the Malaysia HighSpeed rail. This is between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. I had a chance to work on it. We did in the early feasibility stages when it was still a go, until the Prime Minister was kind of found out for corruption, and then the project stalled. But I'm happy to report it's back on track. This will go ahead. And it was the kind of project that required a lot of different disciplines, business advisors, socioeconomic experts, environmental engineers, financial modelers, people that could help us figure out the institutional framework to actually get this implemented, and then those that could help us think about how to get the project actually done. What are the financing mechanisms, et cetera. So this is in Malaysia. This is 7 stations starting up at Bandar Malaysia, basically Kuala Lumpur, and extending down to Nusa Jaya, and then it'll go across the bridge into Singapore. We didn't work on the Singapore part, but we worked on all of these. And so for a country like Malaysia, this is a game-changing investment in infrastructure that will revitalize all of these communities, these 7 communities along the way. And it was the first opportunity, and this was, again, working with Arcadis, and they work all over the world, the first time everything was considered right at the beginning. Socioeconomics, environmental issues, obviously sustainability, and resiliency. And so this project will become an opportunity for economic advancement as well as resiliency development across the whole country. One of the things that we realized was that, and as I mentioned before, if you invest in mobility, if you invest in resiliency and think about it hard, you can start to predict the outcomes. What could happen if you put in a transportation line and make it sustainable in terms of the environment and resilient in terms of hazard and risk? We can identify the national, state, and local benefits, which I'll go through in a minute, and how those are agglomerated to benefit the creation of destinations, and how those will be unlocked as high-speed rail becomes a kind of global catalyst, actually, for Southeast Asia, and one that will engender national pride. So a very big deal for that country. In thinking about the catalytic effect of high-speed rail, we looked at it, as I mentioned, at a couple of different levels. What would be the impact on the nation? It would improve infrastructure to improve international competitiveness. It would improve social capital development, safety, security, and health. It would improve social equality because you get access to places in the country that are not accessible now. The nation wants to increase the female workforce. And so we honed in on that and said, well, how could high-speed rail help? Well, if we can develop education, childcare, these kinds of things around the stations as they're developed, it will enable women to join the workforce. By making this kind of investment in the country, it will attract foreign direct investment, which it did. In the end, the Chinese are building the system for Malaysia. It will operate it and transfer it back. And it will improve opportunities for export. And of course, we looked at what's the impact for all the people that would be either using high-speed rail or living and working near high-speed rail, whether it's a business person, a student, family, retiree, or entrepreneur. So from a sort of social aspect, we considered how could we make sure that they all can benefit. Of course, this was enhancing regional connectedness. Here's the Kuala Lumpur International Airport, which is 1 million miles away from downtown, which is not great. But with a new high-speed rail station about 10 kilometers away, there's a chance for the development of a new kind of satellite CBD that would take advantage of both high-speed rail and air. But one of the things that we found in working on this project was that looking at high-speed rail and other systems like this all over the world, in Japan, Korea, China, France, England, there was always this assumption that if you just built the system and built the stations, then they will come. Economic development will just happen. We found out kind of sheepishly that's not the case. If you do not plan for this development, social, economic, and environmental development around these stations, often it never happens, or it's very delayed. We had a chance after this project to work in the UK on a station that was suffering because it hadn't been planned except for the station itself. And so by going back in and looking at land use and high-speed rail, this is still in Malaysia, looking at what industries could benefit from being at and around the station, whether it's green biotech, optical, scientific equipment, how does real estate come into play, education, and civic functions. And working with those that can predict how industry could develop based on industry that was already there or industry that was ripe for development. We were able to come up with very distinct communities that would be developed around each of these stations. No two alike, because you don't want them competing against each other. You want the system to work as a kind of competitive whole, because in this case, they're actually competing against Singapore and Thailand and other places to the north. So each of the stations had its own character. One, an urban service gateway with a high concentration on health and medical. Another that was based on tourism and innovation with a lot of historic areas already in place. A production nucleus that was looking at electrical and electronic products and building off of a fledgling industry that was already there, et cetera. So each of the stations had its own particular character that would allow it to be economically and socially vibrant, but then as a consequence, resiliently so. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. And then, of course, as all of you that work on urban planning, you have to develop the built program. What are the mix of uses? Where should they be generally located? How big are they? How big is the population to be served, et cetera? But I think with the underpinning of the industry clusters and analysis, then we were able to think about each community in its own unique way. Of course, we worry about the environment. We did have a number of options that we looked at. Working with environmental engineers, we did a very preliminary high-level assessment of all the risks and hazards, air noise, ecology, diversity, social environment, water resources, et cetera. And by looking at that and evaluating them against each other, we were able to select an option that best suited the way forward. But more particularly in Malaysia, conserving mountain terrain, ban land mining, manage air quality by controlling and banning burning and installing fire breaks, manage water quality by making room for water, naturalizing river edges, managing the waste cycle, and prohibit dumping, because a lot of the waterways are very contaminated. Protecting historic areas, of which there are many, conserving those cultural landmarks. And in some cases, we recommended retreat from the floodplains, where the flooding is just too often and it's not worth constantly rebuilding. In the end, we were able to kind of quantify these benefits or outcomes of this investment in not only land developed around each station, the transit-oriented development district, the hub and the regional area, looked at the amount of money that would be invested, the amount of contribution to gross national product, gross national income, both locally and regionally, and the number of permanent high-quality jobs that could be created by investing in high-speed rail. I think, that was, it made the Prime Minister, I think, was a little skeptical about why do we want to put a train in. When you see it in this larger context of the benefits, environmental, social, and economic, it changed his thinking. He said, oh, I see. So I think for us, as we work on these projects, we can be the coordinators, we can be at the heart of it. We looked at phasing for each site, not only what area develops first, but how to market it, how to finance it, and what kind of infrastructure strategy would be needed to make sure that those phases occurred. And lastly, implementing the vision depended on an institutional framework that didn't exist. Actually, the transportation agency that hired us to do this was by charter not allowed to be a developer, so couldn't really be the client, but it needed a government focus. And so we invented MyHSR, which is a development entity that is now working in all of those 7 areas. And the transportation agency that was the originator and survives is the supporter. But that institutional framework was critical in order to figure out how to move this along. And for those of you that work on planning projects, we always figure out who's responsible for what and when, and to make sure that there is stakeholder engagement. Having said that, there is stakeholder engagement in Malaysia, but not in Vietnam, not in China, not in Indonesia. It doesn't exist. So in a way, it's kind of nice. You don't have to go to community meetings. But the bad news is that people are left out. So it's one nice thing about coming back to the States, where stakeholder engagement is critical. And so for Malaysia, this project, this resilient mobility project, is a gateway to the world for them, because it's the beginning of high-speed rail from Singapore up into Malaysia and then up into the rest of Southeast Asia, Thailand, and eventually up into China. It unites 2 cities, Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, within 90 minutes, and thus gives an opportunity for growth in ways never imaginable. And yet at the same time, we can sustain and protect natural and agricultural assets. So in the end, resilient mobility really means resilient cities. Like I said at the beginning, I make every project I work on about mobility. But honestly, as we moving into urban areas, what's the figure now? 70% of us will live in urban areas by 2050, many of which are on coasts and threatened, but that's another story. We need to be working together, whether, again, it's a building you're working on, or groups of buildings, or a transportation system, or a waterway, and that we do for the benefit of everyone, as well as the environment. And again, I'll say, we should be at the heart of this. And the projects that I mentioned, we at Callison RTKL were the project coordinators. We were the ones that got all the engineers together, rowing in the same direction. Occasionally they'd go off on a tangent. We'd say, nope, 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 we're going this way. So it's something that you will learn to do as you practice, become a kind of choreographer or conductor. It's really thrilling to work on projects like this when you have the chance to work with smart people from all around the world. We have the chance at Callison RTKL. These are our offices. I was in Hong Kong, as I mentioned, for 5 years, Shanghai for 5. I'm now back in Chicago. I'm originally from New York. When we work on projects like this, we pull from teams of people across the globe. And so I have a chance to work with my colleagues in London and my colleagues in Los Angeles on these projects. And we're always looking for new skills and new talent. So I hope if you have any interest in some of the things I was talking about, please get in touch with us. We are growing our practice, and I'm really looking forward to this next 20 years. This is going to be a very interesting time because the profession is really changing. Thank you.